"Then let her die," the white CEO said quietly, and the entire hospital lobby fell silent except for the steady beep of distant heart monitors. A frail, elderly woman clutched the admissions counter with trembling hands, her hospital bracelet dangling loosely from her wrist as tears gathered in her tired eyes. "Please," she whispered, "just one more day? My daughter is driving here with the money." Charles Whitmore never raised his voice. He simply adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and looked at the billing supervisor. "Company policy exists for a reason. If we make one exception, we invite 100 more." The supervisor lowered her gaze and nodded reluctantly. Around them, visitors pretended not to stare. Nurses exchanged brief, uneasy glances before returning to their work. The old woman slowly released the edge of the counter as though even hope had become too heavy to hold. Near the cafeteria entrance, a 17-year-old black teenager paused with a tray of untouched food balanced in one hand. His faded employee polo carried the hospital logo above a stitched name tag that read Jordan. He watched the scene without speaking. The fries on his tray had already gone cold. Charles turned away toward a waiting group of executives, discussing expansion plans for another medical center as if nothing unusual had happened. Jordan looked from the disappearing CEO to the elderly woman sitting alone beneath a fluorescent light, quietly wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweater. He walked over, crouched beside her chair, and gently offered the unopened bottle of water from his lunch tray. "You should drink something," he said softly. She accepted it with shaking hands. "Thank you." That was all she could manage. Jordan noticed the admission folder resting on her lap. A yellow notice peeked out from the top. "Payment required before continued treatment." He looked away without reading anything else. Some things deserved privacy, even in desperation. A nurse approached carefully. "Mrs. Ruth Bennett." The elderly woman looked up. "We need to prepare your discharge paperwork unless the balance is resolved." Jordan watched Ruth's shoulders sink ever so slightly. She nodded, forcing a polite smile that convinced no one. The nurse walked away with equal reluctance. Jordan remained kneeling for another moment before quietly standing. His eyes drifted toward the billing office across the lobby. The electronic cue board flashed changing numbers while patients stepped forward one after another. For a few seconds, nothing moved except the rain sliding down the enormous glass windows outside. Jordan slipped one hand into his pocket and felt the smooth edge of a worn debit card. His fingers tightened around it. He stared at the card longer than he had stared at the CEO. Then, without another glance toward Ruth, he crossed the marble floor and joined the payment line. The cashier greeted him with a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" Jordan placed the debit card on the counter. "I need to pay someone else's bill." The cashier blinked. "Do you know the account number?" Jordan slowly turned toward the elderly woman still sitting alone beneath the bright hospital lights. "No," he answered. "Only her name." The cashier typed for several seconds before the remaining balance appeared on the screen. She looked back up, her expression changing instantly. "Young man, are you sure?" Jordan did not ask how much would remain in his own account. He did not ask whether anyone else had already offered to help. He simply slid the card a little closer. At that exact moment, Charles Whitmore stopped walking halfway to the elevators, turned at the sound of the payment terminal approving the transaction, and watched the cashier stare silently at the screen before whispering 4 words that made the billionaire freeze in place. "Your balance is $3. Charles Whitmore did not move for several seconds. The conversations around him blurred into a dull murmur as the cashier quietly removed Jordan's debit card from the payment terminal and looked at the screen once more, hoping she had misread it. "There are $3.17 left," she whispered, almost apologetically. Jordan accepted the card with a small nod, slipped it into his wallet, and reached for the printed receipt without looking at the amount. "Please," he said, lowering his voice, "do not tell Mrs. Bennett who paid." The cashier searched his face, expecting hesitation or regret. She found neither. "Are you related to her?" Jordan shook his head. "No." "Then why?" For the first time, he smiled. It was quiet, almost shy. "Someone once helped my family when they did not have to." He folded the receipt neatly and tucked it into his backpack before walking away toward the employee exit. Charles watched every step. He had seen wealthy donors write 6-figure checks with television cameras waiting outside. He had watched politicians pose beside grateful patients. He had never seen a teenager empty his entire future without asking for recognition. "Find out who he is," Charles said to his executive assistant without taking his eyes off the departing boy. Immediately, the assistant nodded and disappeared toward hospital administration. Outside, evening rain had washed the sidewalks clean. Jordan pulled the hood of his faded jacket over his head and hurried toward the number 11 bus, carefully shielding his backpack beneath one arm. By the time he climbed aboard, the city lights had begun reflecting across the wet streets like scattered gold. He chose the last seat, unzipped his backpack, and quietly unfolded a white envelope. Across the front, in bold blue letters, were the words, "Nursing Program Enrollment Confirmation." Beneath it lay another sheet. "Tuition payment due tomorrow before 5 p.m." Jordan stared at the deadline for several long seconds before slipping both papers back inside, without a word. Across town, Charles sat alone in the back of his black sedan. The assistant handed him a slim folder. "His name is Jordan Hayes, 17 years old, part-time cafeteria employee, excellent attendance record, no disciplinary history." Charles flipped through the pages. "Family. Lives with his father in West Philadelphia. Any connection to Ruth Bennett?" "None that we can find." Charles closed the folder slowly. That answer bothered him more than any explanation could have. The next morning, before sunrise, Jordan quietly unlocked the door to a modest second-floor apartment. He removed his shoes before stepping inside. The smell of coffee lingered in the tiny kitchen, though no fresh pot had been brewed. At the dining table sat Marcus Hayes, his father, studying a small orange prescription bottle that was almost empty. He quickly slid it into a drawer when Jordan walked in. "Long shift?" Marcus asked with an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Jordan nodded and placed a grocery bag on the counter. Inside were bread, eggs, and a carton of milk. Nothing more. He reached into his backpack to remove the tuition envelope, but paused. Instead, he quietly tucked it beneath a stack of unopened mail. Marcus never noticed. Later that morning, while Jordan was washing trays in the hospital cafeteria, the admissions office called his name over the employee intercom. He dried his hands, walked upstairs, and found Charles Whitmore standing alone beside the billing counter, holding a single folded receipt. The billionaire looked directly at him and asked one simple question. "Tell me why you spent every dollar you had on someone you had never met." Jordan looked at the folded receipt in Charles Whitmore's hand before meeting the older man's eyes. Around them, the admissions office carried on as if nothing unusual were happening. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Nurses hurried past with clipboards tucked beneath their arms. "Because she needed it," Jordan answered simply. Charles waited, expecting something more. "You emptied your account," he replied. That was not a small donation. Jordan glanced toward the lobby where Ruth Bennett's room assignment had just appeared on the patient information board. Neither was her problem. The words lingered between them. Charles unfolded the receipt. "Do you know what this money was supposed to pay for?" Jordan remained silent. "College?" Charles asked. A flicker crossed the teenager's face before disappearing. "Something like that." Charles reached into his jacket and removed a checkbook. "I can reimburse you." Jordan took one slow step back. "No, sir. You do not even know the amount." "I know enough." Charles frowned. "Then tell me what you want instead." Jordan's eyes settled on the polished floor for a moment before lifting again. "If you really want to fix something, help the next person before they have to beg." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the cafeteria hallway. Charles remained standing with the unsigned check still resting in his hand. For the first time in years, money had failed to solve a problem before it even began. Later that afternoon, Jordan finished stacking trays and clocked out early. Instead of heading home, he crossed the street to a small pawn shop squeezed between a laundromat and an old bookstore. The owner looked up as Jordan carefully placed a vintage camera on the counter. The leather strap showed years of careful use. "It still works," Jordan said quietly. The owner examined it under a bright lamp. "Family piece." Jordan nodded once. "My mother's." The man hesitated before naming a price. Jordan looked at the camera for several long seconds, gently running his thumb across the worn metal edge one final time. Then he accepted the cash without bargaining. Minutes later, he walked into a neighborhood pharmacy and exchanged nearly every dollar for a small paper bag containing prescription medicine. Across town, Charles sat inside his office studying Jordan's personnel file again. Nothing explained what he had witnessed. No social media campaigns. No interviews. No fundraising pages. The assistant knocked softly before entering. Sir, we checked everything. Charles looked up. And Jordan Hayes has never applied for financial assistance from the hospital. Never requested special treatment. Never filed a complaint. Charles leaned back slowly. So why does this feel like I missed something? Before the assistant could answer, another document arrived from hospital administration. It was Ruth Bennett's original request for emergency financial assistance. A bright red stamp covered the first page. Denied. Charles barely glanced at it until something caught his attention near the bottom corner. There, beneath several approval signatures from nurses and social workers, appeared a final electronic authorization reversing every recommendation. His own digital signature stared back at him. Charles froze. He had absolutely no memory of ever seeing Ruth Bennett's file. Yet according to the hospital records, it was his decision alone that had sent her away before Jordan quietly changed everything. Charles stared at the electronic signature until the words on the screen seemed to blur together. His own name sat beneath the denial order with the same digital approval used for thousands of routine executive documents every year. He looked toward the hospital administrator standing quietly beside the desk. Bring me every emergency assistance request that was denied this month, he said. The administrator hesitated. All of them. Charles met her eyes. Every single one. Within an hour, a conference table was covered with folders. One after another, Charles opened them. Nurses had recommended assistance. Social workers had written detailed notes. Financial counselors had marked several patients as eligible for hardship support. Yet the final page of nearly every file carried the same outcome. Denied. And beneath each denial appeared his electronic signature. Charles slowly removed his reading glasses. Who actually reviews these before they reach me? The room fell silent. Finally, the hospital compliance director answered. The recommendations are processed through the executive financial system. That was not my question. Another uncomfortable pause followed. Most are reviewed by the finance division before the executive authorization is applied. Charles closed the folder without another word. Across town, Jordan stepped out of the pharmacy carrying the small paper bag containing his father's medication. He counted the remaining bills in his wallet. 2 $1 bills. A handful of coins. He stopped outside a neighborhood bakery, looked through the window at fresh bread cooling on metal racks, then quietly kept walking. When he reached home, Marcus Hayes was sitting near the apartment window pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. Jordan placed the prescription bottle on the table with a smile. They had it in stock. Marcus looked at the medicine, then at his son's tired face. What did it cost you? Jordan shrugged lightly. Not much. Marcus seemed unconvinced but said nothing. Instead, he reached into a kitchen drawer and handed Jordan a sealed envelope. This came today. Jordan recognized the blue lettering immediately. Nursing Program Enrollment Office. He already knew what was inside before opening it. Tuition payment reminder. Final deadline. Tomorrow, 5 o'clock. He quietly folded the letter again before his father could read it. The next morning, Charles abandoned his scheduled investor presentation and walked through St. Catherine Hospital without announcing his arrival. Employees stepped aside as he entered the patient assistance office, a department he had never visited before despite owning the hospital system. The room was small, crowded, and far older than the executive suites upstairs. A social worker looked up in surprise. Can I help you? Charles picked up a stack of application forms from her desk. Every page carried handwritten notes, highlighted medical needs, and careful recommendations. How many of these receive approval? The woman hesitated before answering honestly. Very few lately. Charles noticed a locked filing cabinet in the corner. What is in there? Approved cases that were later reversed. His expression hardened. Reversed by whom? The woman slowly handed him one thin folder. On the final page, beneath several recommendations supporting financial assistance, someone had stamped one sentence across the file in bold red ink. Executive override. Charles felt something shift inside him. This was no longer about one frightened elderly woman or one teenager's extraordinary sacrifice. He looked up at the social worker. Who has the authority to issue executive overrides besides me? She answered almost in a whisper. Only corporate finance. At that exact moment, Charles pulled out his phone and canceled every meeting for the rest of the week. Then he made a decision that would change everything. Take me to the executive records archive, he said. I want to see who has really been signing my name. The executive records archive lay beneath the hospital headquarters, far from polished conference rooms and investor presentations. Rows of gray filing cabinets stretched beneath cold fluorescent lights, while secure servers hummed quietly behind reinforced glass. Charles Whitmore walked through the room without speaking. The compliance director unlocked a restricted terminal and stepped aside. "Every executive override is stored here," she said. Charles sat down and entered his credentials. Hundreds of files appeared on the screen. He selected Ruth Bennett's case first. A detailed timeline unfolded before him. The social worker had approved assistance. A medical committee had agreed. The patient relief fund still contained enough money to cover her treatment. Then, exactly 14 minutes later, the approval vanished. In its place appeared an automated executive override carrying Charles's digital signature. He opened another file, then another, and another. The pattern never changed. Recommendations approved. Funds available. Executive override. His signature. His pulse slowed into an uneasy calm. "Show me the system log," he said. The compliance director hesitated before opening another screen. Thousands of automated transactions scrolled past in neat columns. One line caught Charles's attention immediately. Executive authorization generated through financial priority automation. "Automation?" he asked quietly. "Who approved this system?" The director searched older records before answering. "It was introduced 8 years ago during a company-wide efficiency initiative." Charles stared at the date. He remembered approving the modernization project without reading every technical attachment. It had been presented as software designed to reduce paperwork, not to replace judgment. At that moment, his phone vibrated. His executive assistant spoke before Charles could say hello. "Sir, Jordan Hayes did not report for work today." Charles looked up sharply. "Why?" His supervisor said he requested emergency leave this morning. The call ended. Without another word, Charles left the archive and drove across the city himself. He found Jordan sitting quietly outside the admissions building of a small community college. Students carrying backpacks laughed as they crossed the campus, but Jordan remained alone on a weathered wooden bench. An unopened envelope rested beside him. Charles stayed several yards away, unnoticed. A counselor stepped outside holding another folder. "Mr. Hayes?" Jordan stood immediately. "I am sorry," the counselor said gently. "The tuition deadline passed at 5 o'clock yesterday. Your seat has been released to the next applicant." Jordan lowered his eyes for only a moment before forcing a polite smile. "I understand." He accepted the paperwork with both hands, thanked the counselor, and walked away without protest. Charles watched the teenager disappear toward the city bus stop, the same worn backpack hanging from one shoulder. There was no anger, no accusation, only quiet acceptance. Something inside Charles broke that afternoon, not because Jordan had lost his place in school, but because he suddenly understood what that hospital receipt had really cost. Back at headquarters, Charles returned to Ruth Bennett's digital file one final time. Before closing it, he noticed a small attachment that had never been opened. The file name was simple: Internal Patient Relief Fund Audit. He clicked it. A spreadsheet filled the screen. The relief fund had never been empty. Millions of dollars had remained untouched while emergency requests continued to be denied. Charles slowly leaned back in his chair as one final column came into focus. Every dollar removed from patient assistance had been redirected into a separate account labeled Executive Performance Incentive Program. He whispered only 4 words before reaching for the phone. "Get me Graham Voss." Now, Charles found Graham Voss standing alone inside the executive finance suite, calmly pouring coffee as though nothing had changed. Morning sunlight stretched across the glass walls while the city moved far below without the slightest hint that an entire system was beginning to crack. Charles placed the audit report on the table between them. Graham barely glanced at it before setting his cup aside. "You finally opened the attachment," he said with an almost amused smile. Charles stared at him. Patient relief money was redirected into executive incentive accounts. Graham adjusted his tie. Legally reallocated under board-approved performance metrics. People were denied treatment. Graham's expression never changed. People make difficult financial decisions every day. Hospitals do too. Charles felt anger rise for the first time in years, but Graham leaned forward before another word could be spoken. "Think carefully before you continue. If you expose this, every headline will carry your signature, not mine." Silence filled the room. Graham tapped the audit report once with his finger. The public will never understand automated authorization systems. They will only see the name of the chief executive officer. Charles left without answering. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. Every polished wall reflected the same uncomfortable truth. Whether he had known or not, his name had become the face of every denied patient. Across the city, Jordan hurried through the apartment door, carrying 2 grocery bags after picking up an extra shift at a neighborhood diner. The apartment was unusually quiet. "Dad," he called softly. No answer came. One of the grocery bags slipped from his hand as he noticed Marcus Hayes sitting motionless in the kitchen chair, one hand pressed against his chest, while the nearly empty prescription bottle lay on the table beside him. Marcus looked up and forced a weak smile. "I am all right." Jordan dropped to one knee. "We are going to the hospital." "No." Marcus gently shook his head. "Not until payday." Jordan reached for his phone anyway. Minutes later, the ambulance doors closed, and flashing lights reflected across rain-soaked streets as they raced towards St. Catherine Hospital. Jordan sat beside his father, gripping his hand without saying a word. Inside the emergency department, nurses moved quickly while physicians guided Marcus toward an examination room. Jordan remained at the admissions desk, completing paperwork. The billing clerk typed for several moments before looking up with visible discomfort. "Mr. Hayes, there is an emergency deposit required before non-critical admission can continue." Jordan slowly opened his wallet. 2 wrinkled $1 bills and a few coins rested inside. Nothing more. He quietly closed it again. Across the lobby, Charles stepped through the revolving doors after leaving headquarters, intending to speak with Ruth Bennett once more before making his next decision. Instead, he froze. Only a few yards away stood Jordan, the same teenager who had emptied his account for a complete stranger. This time he stood on the opposite side of the counter, staring silently at another payment request he could not meet. Jordan never noticed Charles. His eyes remained fixed on the paperwork while Marcus coughed softly from a nearby wheelchair. The admissions clerk lowered her voice. "I am sorry." Jordan nodded once, trying to hide the fear that had finally reached his eyes. At that exact moment, Charles took one step forward, but before he could speak, his phone rang. The caller identification displayed only one name: Graham Voss. Charles answered. Graham's calm voice carried no emotion at all. "If you pay that bill, every document you found disappears before sunrise. Choose carefully, Charles. You can save one family, or you can save the truth." Charles lowered the phone without answering. Graham had ended the call first, leaving only silence humming through the receiver. Across the admissions lobby, Jordan still stood at the counter, his shoulders straight despite the impossible choice in front of him. Charles looked from the frightened teenager to Marcus Hayes waiting quietly in the wheelchair. Then he reached into his jacket, removed his corporate credit card, and placed it on the admissions desk. "Admit Mr. Hayes immediately," he said. The clerk hesitated only a second before processing the payment. Jordan turned sharply, recognition flashing across his face. "No." Charles looked at him. "Your father needs treatment." Jordan stepped forward and gently slid the card back across the counter. "Not like this." The words surprised everyone within earshot. "I did not pay for Mrs. Bennett, so someone would owe me later." Charles stared at the teenager, unable to respond. Before either man could speak again, a quiet voice came from behind them. "Then perhaps neither of you should owe anyone." Ruth Bennett slowly walked into the lobby, still wearing her hospital wristband, but moving with steady determination. In her hands, she carried a small canvas bag that looked far older than the clothes she wore. She stopped beside Jordan and carefully removed a silver flash drive from the bag. "I have been waiting 22 years to give this to the right person," she said. Charles frowned. "What is it?" Ruth looked directly at him. "The evidence Melissa Carter told me never to destroy." Charles accepted the drive with cautious hands. They moved into a private conference room where an information technology specialist opened the encrypted files. Hundreds of scanned documents appeared across the screen. Original accounting records, internal emails, board memorandums. Then came a folder marked Financial Priority Automation. Charles opened the first document. His own authorization approving the software upgrade appeared at the top. Beneath it was another attachment he had never seen before. A hidden configuration created by Graham Voss and 2 senior finance executives. The system had been deliberately programmed to apply Charles's electronic signature automatically whenever patient assistance exceeded preset financial targets. Every reversal happened without his knowledge. Every denial carried his name. Jordan watched silently from the corner of the room. Charles slowly closed his eyes. "I built the machine," he whispered. "He only changed where it pointed." Ruth nodded gently. "That is why Melissa never blamed you." She opened another file. A scanned letter appeared on the screen in Melissa Carter's handwriting. "If this reaches you one day, remember that the greatest danger is not one dishonest person. It is a good person who becomes too distant to notice what others are doing in his name." Charles could no longer look away. Every decision he had delegated. Every signature he had ignored. Every patient he had never met now stood before him in a single sentence. The room remained silent until the information technology specialist suddenly spoke. "Sir, there is more." He enlarged the final folder. It contained complete transfer records proving millions of dollars had been moved from the Patient Relief Fund into executive bonus accounts over 8 consecutive years. Every transaction traced back to Graham Voss. Charles reached for his phone, but before he could dial, a notification appeared on the screen. Emergency board meeting. Effective immediately, Charles Whitmore had been suspended as Chief Executive Officer pending investigation into financial misconduct. He looked at the message, then at the flash drive resting in his hand. For the first time since this story began, he possessed the truth. But before he could use it, everything he had spent a lifetime building had already begun collapsing around him. Charles read the suspension notice only once before placing his phone face down on the conference table. No anger crossed his face. No attempt to call lawyers or investors. He simply picked up the flash drive Ruth Bennett had protected for so many years and handed it to the compliance director. "Duplicate every file," he said quietly. "One copy goes to federal investigators. One goes to the state attorney general. One goes to the independent hospital board. No one inside this company touches the originals again." The room remained silent for a heartbeat before people began moving with sudden purpose. For the first time since the Patient Relief Fund had been quietly drained, the truth was no longer locked behind executive doors. Meanwhile, Marcus Hayes was settled into a treatment room upstairs. Jordan sat beside the bed, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor while his father rested peacefully for the first time in weeks. A nurse entered carrying updated paperwork. She paused, looked at the computer screen again, then smiled with visible relief. "Your admission deposit has been removed." Jordan frowned. "Removed by who?" The nurse shook her head. "The system shows it was canceled under an emergency executive review." She offered no further explanation before quietly leaving the room. Jordan looked toward the hallway, wondering what had changed. Downstairs, reporters had already begun gathering outside the hospital after rumors of an internal investigation spread across the city. Television cameras pointed toward the entrance as executives hurried through side exits with lowered heads. Graham Voss stepped confidently into the boardroom, expecting another private negotiation. Instead, he found empty chairs and a single envelope waiting in the center of the polished table. Inside rested a formal notice freezing every executive bonus account connected to the patient relief audit, effective immediately. Graham's expression tightened for the first time. Before he could react, investigators entered through the open doorway carrying sealed evidence cases. Charles watched from the opposite end of the hall without speaking. Their eyes met only once. Graham looked away first. By evening, hospital employees gathered quietly in the small patient assistance office that had once processed hopeless applications. The locked filing cabinet stood open. Social workers carefully removed hundreds of folders marked executive override and placed them onto long tables for independent review. Some smiled through tears. Others simply kept working. They had waited years for someone to believe what they had been trying to say. Jordan stepped into the office searching for discharge paperwork for his father. He stopped as one of the social workers approached him carrying a familiar manila folder. It was Ruth Bennett's original application. The bright red denial stamp was still visible across the front. Without saying a word, the social worker gently peeled the old label away. Beneath it appeared the original approval that had never disappeared, only been hidden. She handed the file to Jordan. "This is what should have happened on the first day." Jordan carefully closed the folder and held it against his chest for a moment before returning it. "Then use it to help the next family." Across the room, Charles heard every word. He quietly removed the executive identification badge from his jacket and laid it on the empty desk where so many denied applications had once been stacked. He no longer needed the title to make the next decision. Looking toward Jordan, then toward the rows of reopened patient files, Charles spoke with calm certainty. "Tomorrow morning, I will tell the whole country exactly how this happened, even if it costs me everything I have left." The cameras filled the hospital auditorium long before sunrise, but when Charles Whitmore stepped onto the small stage, he carried no prepared speech and stood behind no polished podium. He placed a single patient assistance folder on the table beside him, the same worn file that had once carried Ruth Bennett's denial. The room fell silent. Instead of defending himself, he quietly described every document investigators had recovered, every failure he had signed without reading, and every responsibility he had accepted without trying to escape. When reporters demanded to know whether he had been deceived, Charles simply answered, "I stopped paying attention to the people behind the paperwork. That failure belongs to me." There was no applause, only the steady scratching of reporters' pens as the truth settled across the room. Over the following months, federal investigators completed their review. Graham Voss and the executives involved were formally removed from their positions, and the Patient Relief Fund was rebuilt under independent community oversight with transparent public reporting. Charles never fought to regain his office. Instead, he quietly resigned from the position he had held for nearly 2 decades and agreed to cooperate fully with every investigation. The expensive corner office overlooking Philadelphia remained empty for weeks before someone else occupied it. Charles never returned to that floor. Across the city, Marcus Hayes slowly regained his strength through steady treatment, and the apartment that had once been filled with unopened bills gradually became quieter. One afternoon, Jordan found another envelope waiting beneath the apartment door. He opened it carefully, expecting another payment reminder. Instead, it contained a new admission letter from the nursing program. A community scholarship, created through an independent educational foundation rather than the hospital, had restored his place. There was no corporate logo inside, no executive signature, only a handwritten note from the scholarship committee thanking him for demonstrating the kind of compassion they hoped every future nurse would carry into a hospital room. Jordan folded the letter with the same quiet care he had shown every receipt throughout the journey. Weeks later, Ruth Bennett returned to St. Catherine Hospital, not as a patient, but as a volunteer welcoming families who arrived frightened and uncertain. She often recognized the same anxious expressions she had once carried herself. Sometimes she simply sat beside them without speaking. Sometimes silence helped more than explanations ever could. Nearly 18 months after that rainy afternoon, Jordan walked through the front entrance of St. Catherine wearing the dark blue uniform of a nursing student beginning his clinical rotation. Patients, visitors, and staff passed him without recognizing the teenager who had once emptied his bank account for a stranger. Near the admissions counter, a young father stood nervously counting a handful of wrinkled bills while glancing toward his frightened little daughter. Jordan quietly stepped beside the billing clerk, reviewed the newly restored patient assistance approval, and slid the completed form back across the counter before the father could finish counting. The man looked up in disbelief, but Jordan had already turned toward the hallway where another patient needed help. Outside the hospital, Charles watched through the glass entrance before continuing down the sidewalk without announcing his presence. He did not wave. He did not interrupt. He simply smiled once and kept walking into the morning light. Behind him, the hospital doors opened again for another family, not because power had finally learned how to give, but because one ordinary teenager had quietly shown an entire system that the strongest hands are often the ones willing to let someone else walk through the door first.